In the 4 years since I wrote American Sour Beers, there haven't been any major changes in the ways that most breweries produce sour beers. In general, they fall into two categories: quick sours, like kettle souring, or traditional mixed fermentations. For a kettle sour, you pitch lactobacillus right at the start, allow it to drop the pH very quickly over a couple of days, pasteurize, and then follow up with the brewer's yeast to finish out the fermentation, producing most of the ethanol and the carbon dioxide. On the other hand, that traditional mixed fermentation relies on pediococcus to slowly produce acid over time, in tandem with Brettanomyces, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and sometimes some other wild microbes. In either case, it's the bacteria, the lactobacillus or the pediococcus, that produces the lactic acid, making a sour beer. Recently, though, there's been a lot of excitement about these so-called lactic acid yeast strains. These are yeast, just like Saccharomyces or Brettanomyces, that produce lactic acid in addition to ethanol and carbon dioxide. There wasn't a lot of information about these a few years ago, but recently there have been a few papers that have come out and a lot of microbe prospecting that has turned up some pretty promising strains. The pitch is that they have advantages over either kettle souring or mixed fermentation. Compared to the quicker methods, they're one-stop shops. You just pitch this one microbe and let it go. No monitoring the pH, no heating back up to pasteurize, no worries about inhibition from the hops that you might want to add to the boil. It's just an easy thing that you could do at home, or that a commercial brewer can add to a tank and not have to worry about messing up their timing. Compared to a mixed fermentation, there's a much lower risk of cross-contamination. I've heard it described as similar to the risk of using a Belgian strain, a fermenter that you might otherwise use an English strain or an American ale strain in. It's also considerably quicker than the traditional mixed fermentation, a couple of weeks compared to, months or more. So I decided I wanted to give it a shot. I reached out to a couple of labs, and luckily for me, Dr. Matt Bachman from Wild Yeast got back to me. I'd never talked to him before, but I'd been aware of him for a few years. He'd written a paper on terminal acid shock response in bottle conditioning. He proposed a way to condition the yeast you were using for bottle conditioning with a little of the already very sour beer that it was going into, to sort of prepare it to acclimate to that environment before it was added for bottle conditioning. He luckily sent me a couple of fresh vials of his Hanseosporia vineae and his Wicker Hamomyces anomalous. I'm sure I just butchered both of those, so I apologize, but they're both relatively new strains to me, and honestly, I haven't heard many people talk about them. I decided that I wanted to try these out both on their own and with a beer that had significant hopping to it. So I made a 12-gallon batch of beer. I split it 4 ways. I drew off a small portion of the batch to ferment with just the yeast after just about 5 IBUs of Mosaic at 10 minutes. But the rest of it, I had big whirlpool addition, I had dry hopping, again, trying to take advantage of what these strains can do that lactobacillus can't. In the end, though, as exciting as a shortened production timeline or an easier process, appeals to me, if they don't produce flavors that I'm excited about, if they don't produce lactic acid reliably, they're not worth using. So, let's get on with the brew day. For the grist, I went with a relatively simple grain bill. 39% wheat malt, 46% raw 2-row brewer's malt, and 16% golden naked oats. I was aiming for a relatively modest alcohol, so I wanted to ensure a body and balance between the acid and the hops. The raw 2-row isn't too toasty, it's not bready or biscuity or anything like that, so it doesn't clash with the fruity flavors or the acid. The wheat adds extra proteins, boosting body and head retention. The oats play a similar role, although they're a little bit more characterful, a little more darker, adding a nice silkiness to the body. I also like their berry flavor. I think it goes really nicely in hoppy beers. I'm still happy with my Monster Mill. It doesn't slip, it gives a good grind even on the smaller grains, and it's pretty quick. Overall, it's been a huge quality of life upgrade compared to my old one. I didn't realize, though, until after this batch that it actually lost two of the bolts that secure the hopper to the base. They must have ended up in one of my batches the last couple of weeks and probably got tossed out with the spent grain. Probably should get some new ones and tighten it up. As you can see, it was rocking pretty good by the end of this one. I targeted a mash temperature of 152 Fahrenheit, that's 67 Celsius. I want to ensure pretty good attenuation, just to make sure the beer was nice and drinkable as a session beer to have on tap. Both strains are supposed to have relatively typical attenuation compared to just an average Saccharomyces strain, not the hyper attenuation that Brettanomyces provides to long-term sour beers. Given the hops and acid, though, I didn't want really high Saison-like attenuation, so again, right in the middle of the typical saccharification range. I wanted to make sure the mash pH was in line, so I added a few teaspoons of phosphoric acid just to get the drop, along with some calcium chloride. Like a lot of sour beers, I favor calcium chloride because it helps to add some body and roundness to the beer. I didn't want to accentuate the hop bitterness, which is what the sulfate in gypsum would have done. Otherwise, it was a fairly typical brew day. Good hop break, thanks to the proper pH and all that calcium. And by the end of the boil, it had reached my target original gravity of 1.052. I recirculated the wort through the plate chiller for the last 15 minutes of the boil to pasteurize it. All of that's a pretty big hassle compared to just dropping an immersion chiller down into the wort for the last 15 minutes of the boil. But I had a good reason. I want to preserve 2 gallons of the wort after the first 10-minute edition of Mosaic, just 6 IBUs, for comparison for a base beer to just see how these microbes tasted on their own. In this case, since we're dealing with yeast, I wasn't worried about inhibition, but I still wanted to lower the temperature to reduce the extraction and the isomerization of the bittering compounds. So I recirculated a little bit of wort through the chiller while the water was still running and back into the kettle, getting it down to about 175 Fahrenheit. While there may still be some bitterness extracted at this point and some isomerization, it's going to be a lot less than there would be had I add those hops right at flame at it, right off the boil. There's something about bitterness and sourness that just don't mesh together on our tongues or in our brains. We think of almost every one of the other sort of primary flavor combinations out there. I'm talking things like sweet and sour, salty bitter, bitter sweet, salty sour, and salty sweet. All of those we can think of beers and foods that we enjoy. But there's something about too much sourness and too much bitterness that really just clashes and says, hey, this isn't a great thing to be drinking or eating. I mean, all beer is a little bit tart, but when you talk about sour beer sour and IPA bitter, you're going to get some real rough clashing flavors. The yeast had been packaged just 2 days before I brewed, so no need for stars in this case. I pitched 10 milliliters of each into the small jugs and 40 milliliters of each into the hopped up wort in the bigger fermenters. I shook all 4 of them to introduce some oxygen. These are yeast after all, and they should benefit from oxygen at the start to enhance cell growth and respiration. Then it was time to clean out my plate chiller. Once I'm finished brewing, cleaning the spent grain out of the mash tun, scrubbing the kettle, I'm usually ready for a break and a beer. That's why I love immersion chillers. Spray it off with water and you're pretty much done. For the plate chiller, on the other hand, I took it out, hooked up a hose to flush it in reverse, trying to get rid of all of the wort, the trub that was trapped in there. Even with the hop screen that I use, the hop spider, some hop particulate probably makes its way in there. Then I recirculate 140 degree or 60 Celsius water laced with a brewery cleaner. In this case, I have a bucket of Brew. I do that in both directions, finally flushing it out again, and then I filled it with star sand. The first 4 days of fermentation for WH82 wicker Hamomyces seemed pretty standard, a little maybe subdued compared to Saccharomyces strain, but still quick activation and, various things that looked like a Krausen. I kept it next to the radiator, trying to keep it warm. Strain excels well, ferments quickly up above 70, but the warmest I seemed to be able to get was 70 Fahrenheit.
By day 5, it was looking pretty finished, but when I took a gravity reading of the hoppy version, it was still at 1039, just 25% apparent attenuation. The pH had dropped nicely, though, to 3.73. After another week, it was down to 1012, 75% attenuation, and the pH was down to 3.52. Pretty good. The YH72 Hanseospora seemed pretty similar. It looked like it was fermenting well, but by day 5 was only down to 1038, just about 27% attenuation, and the pH also had dropped to 3.79. Again, I left it warm, I tried to let it keep going, and even at 13 days into the fermentation, it was still only at 40% attenuation. Really, I was getting pretty worried at this point. Luckily, after a few more days, it was ready to keg, having dropped down to 1015 by day 17. In both cases, I dry hopped with 1 ounce each of Mosaic and Amarillo 2 days before kegging. Another huge thanks to Wild Pitch Yeast Co. for hooking me up with these samples to try out at home.
Okay, first up, the Wiccohammomyces. Looks like pretty good clarity. Carbonated up nicely in bottle conditioning. Ooh, beautiful foam. Okay. And for the tap. Similar, but definitely a little bit more haze. Certainly not a cloudy beer. You know, not surprising given all the wheat and the oats, more than 50% of the grist. Let's give them a smell. Without the hops, it's got a little bit of a sort of almost a cidery, apple cider, not quite apple cider vinegar, but a little bit of acetic going in that direction. Great head retention despite not lowering the pH before fermentation as I would for a sour beer. Mosaic and Amarillo really give it a much brighter, fruitier, I don't get that cider at all. Okay, let's see how the flavor compares. Yeah, decent little tangy, tart, bright acidity. Finish has got a little bit of tetrahydropyridine, that toasty, weedy Cheerio almost flavor. Not a bad beer, but it doesn't have the brightness I expect from that low pH. It's not the crisp, spritzy, lactic kind of thing that you'd expect from a Berliner Weiss. It's a little bit more kind of like an old Saison, maybe. It's got some weird estery character, maybe some addition of the apple, maybe some pear or something. Yeah, it's okay. Let's try it with the hopped up version. Those hops really sort of coat through the mouth. Not super intensely hopped. It's definitely not a, you know, an IPA level of hoppiness, but that added citrus, that added fruitiness from the Mosaic and the Amarillo really goes together nicely with the acid. It has a little of that, has a little toastiness in it as well, but it's a lot more restrained. It's a lot more subtle. Hard to say if that's just because the hops are covering it up or if there's actually a lower amount because it wasn't naturally conditioned like that was. The acidity seems a lot cleaner. If you didn't tell me, I would think that this was fermented with lactobacillus and maybe a little bit of Belgian yeast. It's definitely a slight phenolic in there, a slight spiciness. pretty pleasant though. Bright, easy fermenting, easy drinking. Yeah, I'd recommend this one. It's not too weird. It's got a nice amount of acid without being over the top. On its own, I'm not wowed by it. Seems like a nice base, but it's not a yeast strain that's going to carry a beer on its own that doesn't have much else going on. Okay, and next up, the Hanseasporia. Again, good looking pour, nice carbonation. Glad both of these work for bottle conditioning even after sitting for about a month in the primary fermenter. Okay, and the hoppy version. I'm running these both on the same tap line, just switching them back and forth. I over budgeted how much room I had in the kegerator. Yeah. And actually a little bit clearer than the Wicco-Hemomyces, I think. They're a little bit more similar. I think the hoppier one is still a little bit hazier, but pretty similar. Let's see how they compare. It's a really interesting aroma. It's got a little bit more character, a little bit more funk than the Wicco-Hemomyces. A little bit more maybe tropical, but still some of that appley, cidery, very, very light vinegar sort of character. A little more phenolic too. Okay, and the hoppy one. Similar big, tropical citrusy, that mosaic really helps to restrain the fruitiness of the Amarillo, cut through that sort of aspirin character you can get sometime. While the Amarillo tempers the mosaic, doesn't get too dank or too of that bold sort of weird fruitiness it can get sometimes. Yeah, a little more tropical, a little bit more perfumey maybe. Similar sort of acidity level, maybe just a touch more snappy lactic than the Wicco-Hemomyces. Yeast character comes through just a little bit more too. It's just a little bit more expressive strain. Yeah, the finish just isn't quite as bright and lively as I want it to be. It just sort of tastes like, a Saison that's just a little bit past its prime. Again, it's surprising. This isn't even 2 months old at this point. I didn't rack it to secondary. There's, it shouldn't have that much oxygen picked up in the bottle, although obviously bottling a 1 gallon batch isn't exactly the most pristine process. It doesn't have that toastiness, that THP that the other one had. It's certainly a little bit drier, a little bit brighter, but not quite there for me. Good carbonation. Same little toastiness, I think probably from the Golden Naked Oats. Pretty pleasant. Yeah, overall a really nice beer. It is a little more acidic, a little snappier than the Wicco-Hemomyces. It isn't, funky or anything like that. You wouldn't think it was Brettanomyces, but it's a little bit more Belgian than the other one. A little bit more phenolic, a little bit more estery, and particularly good esters. And I think work well with the hops. So, 2 pretty interesting yeast strains. I think they mostly lived up to their billing. They both attenuated, produced lactic acid, held up against the hops, although it took a little bit longer than I would have liked. And the resulting beers are pretty good. Kind of like a kettle sour, the base beers don't wow. A kettle soured Berliner Weiss has never been at the top of my list. It's missing some sort of signature flavor. I love Berliner Weiss, it's one of my favorite styles, but that mixed fermentation, really produces a better beer if you aren't going to be adding fruit or dry hops. And similarly, in this case, I don't think the yeast strains on their own produce a great character. It's serviceable, it's better than some sour beers I've made, but it's not better than most. On the other hand, with the Amarillo, with the Mosaic, with those brighter, fruitier flavors from the dry hopping, I think it's perfect. You don't miss any of the nuance from a mixed fermentation. It was quicker, it was easier. It was nice not having to do a kettle sour where I'm heating it back up again. It all worked out pretty well. I think both strains have their pluses and minuses. Up until now, I was actually thinking that the Wicker Hammomyces was my favorite, but actually having them again, the yeast character I think calmed down a little bit in the Hanseasporia, and I'm liking that one a little bit more now. It's just a little bit more tropical, brighter, a little fruitier. Really nice. This isn't the final answer to this lactic acid yeast question. I think it's a new way of producing sour beers that holds some promise, but it's not going to completely change the way that most people brew sour beers. While it has some advantages, it has some disadvantages as well. I'm going to keep playing with it, keep trying it. Obviously, the first time I did a kettle sour, the first time I did a mixed fermentation, the results weren't perfect. It takes some time to figure out pitching rates, temperatures, all those other details of the production. Not to mention, these are just one strain each, one isolate each from two different species. There's probably a whole range of these different microbes out there with, just like Saccharomyces and just like Brettanomyces, huge ranges of flavors, fermentation dynamics, all those sorts of things. So, one fun experiment. I'm looking forward to seeing what other people try with these and what works for them. Hopefully more of these yeast labs and some of the bigger yeast labs will get in on this game and start making these more easily available. But until then, hopefully people are getting to play with them either through microbe exchanges with other homebrewers or when they are available from some of these smaller yeast labs. Well, hopefully you enjoyed this one. Hoping to do these videos when I have time in between other projects, but this one seemed like a perfect example of something a little bit more interesting that would be fun to watch. As always, there's a link in the description that goes to the blog post with all of the specific recipe details and the process and all of that. So, see you next time.